This video is sponsored by Marxist-Leninist Reading Hub. The challenges in exploring Marxism-Leninism can feel overwhelming, especially without guidance. But Marxist-Leninist Reading Hub makes it easier. Discover carefully curated reading lists from beginner-friendly introductions to advanced texts on communist theory and history. Each month, Marxist-Leninist Reading Hub distributes over $300 worth of books, including free, half-price, and at-cost options for individuals and organizations. You can also join their Discord to discuss world events or connect with comrades across the world. Find their website at mlreadinghub.org. In the preface to the French and German edition of Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Vladimir Lenin explains that World War I was an imperialist, annexationist, predatory war of plunder on the part of both sides. It was a war for the division of the world, for the partition and repartition of colonies and spheres of influence of finance capital, which he insists must be understood as an economic and political phenomenon, and closely studied by communists to prepare for the impending socialist revolution. Finance capital, a term drawn from the Marxist economist Rudolf Hilferding, was central to Lenin's conception of imperialism. Hilferding's 1910 book, Finance Capital, argued that the rise of giant banks and industrial cartels had fused industrial capital with banking capital. This new synthesis, finance capital, gave rise to vast monopolies that came to dominate entire sectors of the economy and extend their influence over the state itself. For Hilferding, finance capital sought political control of foreign territories not merely to sell goods, but to secure investments, raw materials, and colonies. Lenin identified this fusion of financial and industrial power, driving capitalist expansion abroad, as the economic engine of imperialism. Lenin was also influenced by Nikolai Bukharin's 1915 work, Imperialism and World Economy, written almost immediately before Lenin's text. Bukharin emphasized that monopolies did not simply operate within nations, but organized national capitalist blocs backed by the respective states. In the imperialist era, he argued, the world economy became a battlefield between rival capitalists, but took the form of rival states seeking to expand their territory. Lenin drew heavily on Bukharin's Marxist theoretical framework, but put further emphasis on the role of monopolies and the political nature of imperialism. On these questions, Lenin was heavily influenced by the work of John Hobson, an English bourgeois economist who critiqued imperialism from a liberal perspective, but also offered key insights through his investigative rigor and empirical evidence. Hobson argued that imperialism was driven by underconsumption and the need to export surplus capital, and that the solution was to be found in greater democratic control and reforms on immigration and redistribution policies. Lenin found key insights through Hobson's analysis, but disagreed with his conclusions, which he juxtaposed with his Marxist framework that arrived at a more revolutionary rather than reformist conclusion. Lenin opens his text by declaring, "The enormous growth of industry and the remarkably rapid process of concentration of production in ever larger enterprises represents one of the most characteristic features of capitalism." Drawing extensively on statistical data from Germany and the United States at the turn of the 20th century, Lenin illustrates how industrial production became increasingly monopolized, transforming the competitive dynamics of early capitalism into a new stage dominated by powerful cartels, syndicates, and trusts, laying the economic foundation for imperialist expansion and global rivalry. He explains that in 1907, large German enterprises employing more than 50 workers constituted only about 0.9% of all industrial firms, yet remarkably employed almost 40% of the industrial workforce. Additionally, he says, less than 1/100th of the total number of enterprises utilize more than 3/4 of the total amount of steam and electric power. tens of thousands of huge enterprises are everything. Millions of small ones are nothing. He then goes on to identify a similar, even more pronounced pattern in the United States. He says almost half the total production of all the enterprises of the country was carried on by 1/100th part of these enterprises. This transformation of competition into monopoly is one of the most important, if not the most important, phenomena of the modern capitalist economy. Monopoly formation is accelerated by the combination of multiple related industries within a single large enterprise. Monopolies arise as large enterprises that consolidate market dominance through cartels and syndicates, allowing them to regulate production levels, dictate prices, and secure consistently high profits. He argues that monopolies developed along three general stages. First, in 1860 to 1870, it was the highest stage of free competition, where monopoly, in its embryonic form, was barely discernible. Number two, after the crisis of 1873, the development of cartels, syndicates, and trusts began to take form, but were still the exception. They were not yet durable, but a transitory phenomenon. Number three, the boom at the end of the 19th century and the crisis of 1900 to 1903 saw cartels become one of the foundations of the whole of economic life, and capitalism had been transformed into imperialism. Capitalism departed from production-based competition towards speculative and coercive practices rooted in finance capital. He explains how this process generates substantial superprofits beyond those achievable by isolated, non-combined enterprises, which are then eliminated from the market. This concentration of industrial capital, held by a few monopolies, is the eventual outcome of a drawn-out process of market competition, therefore undermining conventional capitalist ideals of indefinite free market competition. He says that competition becomes transformed into monopoly. The result is immense progress in the socialization of production. In particular, the process of technical invention and improvement becomes socialized. This is no longer the old type of free competition between manufacturers, scattered and out of touch with one another, and producing for an unknown market. Here, skilled labor is monopolized. Capitalism and its imperialist stage arrives at a threshold of the most complete socialization of production. In spite of themselves, the capitalists are dragged, as it were, into the new social order, which marks the transition from complete free competition to complete socialization. Production becomes social, but appropriation remains private. The social means of production remain the private property of a few. Unlike the economic resilience of monopolies, smaller enterprises become crushed between the high price of raw material and the low retail price of the finished product. These pressures are further exacerbated by economic downturns. The crisis of 1900, for example, demonstrated clearly that smaller, non-monopolized enterprises were especially vulnerable to economic downturn, leading to an intensified concentration of capital into increasingly resilient large-scale enterprises. Lenin highlights that these crises resulted in a far greater concentration of industry, solidifying the dominance of monopolies in modern capitalist economies. Monopolies buttress their dominance through aggressive methods and coercion, such as cutting off supply lines, forming labor agreements with trade unions to exclude non-monopoly enterprises, systematic price cutting to eliminate competition, and outright boycotts. Workers and smaller producers, despite their essential role in a highly integrated economy, thus find themselves increasingly subordinated to the interests of a narrow elite of monopolist financiers. We see here the monopolists throttling those who do not submit to them, to their yoke, to their dictation. The development of capitalism has arrived at a stage when, although commodity production still reigns and continues to be regarded as the basis of economic life, it has in reality been undermined, and the bulk of the profits go to the geniuses of financial manipulation. Lenin concludes this chapter by firmly rejecting the notion, advanced by some bourgeois economists, that cartels and monopolies stabilize capitalism by preventing economic crises. Lenin insists that monopolies intensify capitalism's inherent contradictions, particularly deepening the uneven development among different industries and agriculture, while arguing that monopolies in heavy industry deepen the lack of coordination within the capitalist system by exacerbating instability and economic disparity. In concluding the matter, he highlights how Marx foresaw the inherent tendency of capitalism to move towards concentration and eventually monopoly. Initially ignored or dismissed, Marx's insights were vindicated as monopolies undeniably became one of the foundations of economic life by the early 20th century. Lenin explains that historically, banks initially functioned as middlemen by collecting inactive money and making it available to the capitalist class to become active, profit-generating capital. However, as capitalism develops, banks undergo rapid concentration, shifting from modest intermediaries into powerful monopolies controlling vast amounts of money capital, means of production, and sources of raw materials. He illustrates this with concrete examples from Germany, where between 1907 and 1913, banking deposits increased by 40%, most of which concentrated into just a few large banks. By 1912 to 1913, 9 large Berlin banks alone held 49% of all German bank deposits. These 9 Berlin banks, together with their affiliates, controlled about 83% of total German bank capital. It is obvious that a bank which stands at the head of such a group has already outgrown the part of a middleman and has become an association of a handful of monopolists. One critical mechanism facilitating banking concentration is the system of holdings, whereby large banks not only absorb smaller banks, but also subordinate them into interconnected financial groups. As banking becomes concentrated, a dense network of branches and affiliate banks emerges, enabling centralized control over national economies and beyond. Lenin points to the rapid expansion of Germany's big banks, which by 1911 had established 450 total establishments nationwide, centralizing economic power and subordinating formerly independent local units. Similar processes also occurred internationally. In Britain and France, for example, banks also rapidly expanded branch networks, centralizing immense financial resources. In France, Crédit Lyonnais grew from just 64 branches in 1870 to 1,229 by 1909. This expansion of bank branches, along with exponential increases in their accounts, transforms scattered capitalists into what Lenin terms a single international capitalist, capable of dominating the entire capitalist economy. This concentration of banking radically changes banks' influence over industry and commerce. Rather than performing merely technical, auxiliary functions, banks become capable of shaping the destiny of entire enterprises or industries. Lenin notes that through their control of credit, banks can entirely determine a capitalist's fate, determine their income, deprive them of capital, or permit them to increase their capital rapidly and to enormous dimensions. Banks' concentrated control over industry becomes especially evident through interconnected directorships. Lenin points out that the directors of just 6 large German banks simultaneously held positions in hundreds of industrial enterprises, effectively linking financial and industrial power. This intricate connectedness between banks, industry, and government officials ensures banks' influence permeates nearly all sectors of economic and political life. Furthermore, banks themselves reorganize internally, developing highly specialized departments for different industrial sectors. This heightened division of labor within banks elevates bank directors who are experts not only in finance, but also in specific branches of industry. Even large industrial associations are subordinated by the dictatorial economic power that banks hold over industry, transforming them merely into small capital under monopolistic finance. As Lenin observes, the old capitalism has had its day. The new capitalism represents a transition towards something. The 20th century marks the turning point from the old capitalism to the new, from the domination of capital in general to the domination of finance capital. Banks' power also manifests through direct control over economic development and technical progress, as they finance research and technological innovations, benefiting preferred monopolies to the detriment of small capital. Large banks systematically promote technological advancements, but primarily to strengthen their monopolistic allies. Such power means that capitalist economic policy becomes increasingly centralized in the hands of financial institutions whose interests dominate society. The concentration movement of the banks is narrowing the circle of establishments from which it is possible to obtain credits, and is consequently increasing the dependence of big industry upon a small number of banking groups. These developments reached a critical stage around the turn of the 20th century. The crisis of 1900 significantly accelerated banks' monopolistic integration with industry, marking a decisive shift from traditional capitalism based on competition to a new capitalism dominated by finance capital. Therefore, Lenin identifies the early 20th century as the definitive point when capitalism's transformation into imperialist monopoly capitalism became irreversible. Lenin begins this chapter by defining finance capital as the fusion of banking and industrial capital, describing it as capital controlled by banks but employed by industrialists. This merger between industrial and finance capital signifies a shift from earlier capitalism, where industrialists directly own the capital they employed, into a new phase where industrialists increasingly rely on banks to provide the capital essential for production. Lenin emphasizes that other Marxist writers, while providing valuable insights into the nature of finance capital and imperialism, often overlook the transformation of production and capital concentration into outright monopoly. He says, the concentration of production, the monopolies arising therefrom, the merging or coalescence of the banks with industry, this is the history of finance capital and what gives the term its content. The domination of finance capital becomes the domination of a financial oligarchy, who try to minimize the outward appearance of their power through innovative theories. But the monstrous fact concerning the monstrous rule of the financial oligarchy are so striking that in all the capitalist countries, a whole literature has sprung up, written from the bourgeois point of view, but which, nevertheless, gives a fairly accurate picture and criticism of this oligarchy. He argues that the holding system is the cornerstone of the financial oligarchy. It has discovered, through practice, that it is sufficient to own only 40% of a company while still maintaining control over its affairs. The so-called democratization of shares, whereby smaller capitalists are able to purchase shares of a larger capitalist, supposedly represents a democratization of capital. But in reality, smaller companies are simply purchased as subsidiaries by larger ones and then used to mitigate the liabilities of the parent company, granting them virtual impunity for their crimes and shady tricks. He says finance capital, concentrated in a few hands, exercising a virtual monopoly, exacts enormous and ever-increasing profits from the floating companies, issue of stock, state loans, etc., tightens the grip of the financial oligarchies, and levies tribute upon the whole of society for the benefit of their monopolists. For example, methods of balance sheet manipulation are commonplace under monopoly capitalism, where opaque corporate structures allow financial oligarchs to escape the consequences of unsuccessful speculation, unlike smaller business owners who risk their own capital directly. Furthermore, during economic downturns, finance capital exploits crises by absorbing failing enterprises cheaply, restructuring them, and generating profits even from these bankruptcies. He says, during periods of industrial boom, the profits of finance capital are immense, but during periods of depression, small and unsound businesses go out of existence, and the big banks acquire holdings in them by buying them for next to nothing or in profitable schemes for their reconstruction and reorganization. He argues that this was made possible through the separation of money capital from industrial or productive capital. In other words, the entrepreneur who applies capital productively becomes separate from the rentier who manages money capital. Imperialism, or the rule of finance capital, is that highest stage of capitalism in which this separation reaches vast proportions. The supremacy of finance capital over all other forms of capital means the rule of the rent here and of the financial oligarchy. It means the crystallization of a small number of financially powerful states from among all the rest. The extent to which this process is going on may be judged from the statistics on the issue of all kinds of securities. He concludes with figures showing a dramatic increase in global securities issuance, doubling in the first decades of the 20th century alone. He points out how just 4 countries, Britain, France, Germany, and the United States, by 1910, controlled approximately 80% of the world's finance capital. This enormous concentration of financial power in a few leading capitalist nations created an international network of dependency wherein virtually the entire global economy becomes tributary to these financial centers. While earlier stages of capitalism involved intense international trade, with England famously calling itself the workshop of the world, supplying goods globally in exchange for raw materials, the monopoly stage of capitalism of the 19th and early 20th centuries evolved differently. As Lenin says, typical of the old capitalism, when free competition held undivided sway, was the export of goods. Typical of the latest stage of capitalism, when monopolies rule, is the export of capital. Under monopoly capitalism, a significant surplus of capital accumulates in advanced countries as a direct consequence of uneven global economic development, which leads to chronic poverty among the masses, conditions that are inherent to capitalism itself. He argues that if capitalism could resolve these contradictions, it would not be capitalism, because uneven development and widespread poverty are intrinsic to the capitalist mode of production itself. This is because surplus capital seeks profitable outlets abroad and is exported to less developed regions where it can reap greater returns due to cheap labor, low land prices, and inexpensive raw materials. Thus, capitalist states transform their surplus into foreign investments, effectively perpetuating their own dominance. Britain, France, and Germany increased their capital exports dramatically from the mid-19th to early 20th century, and by 1914 had between 175 and 200 billion francs invested abroad, generating substantial returns, or what Lenin calls a sound basis for the imperialist oppression and exploitation of most of the countries and nations of the world. Throughout this process, the distribution of capital took on geographical characteristics based on distinct national patterns. British capital was primarily invested into its vast colonies, thus directly linking its capital export to colonial imperialism. French capital, mainly loaned to European countries such as Russia, represented what Lenin calls usury imperialism, heavily oriented towards financial rather than industrial dominance. Meanwhile, German capital, lacking extensive colonies, spread relatively evenly between Europe and America. While the export of capital can partly slow the domestic development of the exporting countries, since profits flow outward rather than inward, it simultaneously accelerates capitalist development globally. Exported capital builds infrastructure, railways, industries, and thereby deepens capitalist relations internationally. Finance capital specifically shapes these arrangements, with credit lending as a key instrument of imperialist policy. Capital exporting countries, despite political tensions or economic instability, rarely refuse loans out of fear of losing strategic advantages to rival lenders. Lenin notes the frequent practice of loans stipulating conditions such as favorable clauses in commercial treaties, military contracts, or infrastructure concessions, effectively transforming the export of capital into a direct method for securing markets and geopolitical influence. He also emphasizes the global reach of finance capital through colonial banking systems by pointing out the sheer scale of banking operations in colonies by major imperialist powers. Such banking networks ensure that finance capital dominates entire markets, securing control over foreign development, expanding its scope, while intensifying the contradictions of capitalism on a global scale. At first, capitalist monopolies dominate their domestic markets. However, as capitalism inevitably creates a global market, monopolistic corporations begin seeking agreements beyond their home countries. This, Lenin argues, led to a new stage of world concentration of capital and production, incomparably higher than the preceding stages. For example, by the early 20th century, Germany and the United States had emerged as the dominant players, each consolidating vast monopolistic power. In Germany, the 1900 economic crisis significantly accelerated monopoly formation as powerful banks deliberately facilitated the collapse of smaller, independent firms. The German electrical industry, for example, swiftly condensed from multiple competing groups into just two giants. By 1912, the AEG Corporation, through an intricate holding system, controlled between 175 and 200 subsidiary companies, wielding vast international power. This German consolidation paralleled developments in America, where the General Electric Company achieved a similarly dominant position. In 1907, these two trusts explicitly divided the global electrical market between them, eliminating competition by assigning territories. The American General Electric Company took the US and Canada, while Germany's AEG claimed continental Europe and other significant regions. The oil industry is another important example. Initially, two dominant groups controlled world oil production: Rockefeller's Standard Oil in America and the Rothschild Nobel Group in Russia. But as new players, such as German banks, entered the scene, intense competition erupted, particularly between Rockefeller and Deutsche Bank. After fierce rivalry, Deutsche Bank, lacking the resources of Standard Oil, was forced into submission and was compelled to agree not to attempt anything which might injure American interests. Similar international divisions can be observed in merchant shipping as well. Major German shipping companies like Hamburg America and Neudeutscher Lloyd formed agreements with the American-based Morgan Shipping Trust, dividing global maritime markets, ports, and profits between themselves. These monopolistic agreements explicitly established a division of markets, effectively eliminating international competition. The international division of markets is also partly established through the International Rail Cartel. After early failures, it eventually succeeded in dividing the global market for rails among British, German, Belgian, and later American, French, Austrian, and Spanish firms. The arrangement fixed price quotas, effectively carving the global rail market into carefully defined national shares. Lenin concludes this chapter by criticizing the view, expressed by some bourgeois theorists and opportunists, such as Karl Kautsky, that international cartels might promote peace among nations. He calls this view absolutely absurd theoretically and dishonest practically. For Lenin, international cartels do not eliminate capitalist conflict, but intensify them by clearly demarcating the fields of competition, thereby highlighting and sharpening the ongoing struggle for global market dominance. He emphasizes that capitalism inherently drives the division and redivision of the world, determined ultimately in proportion to capital, and therefore inevitably shifts with changes in economic and political power relations. Finance capital inevitably infiltrates political and public institutions, eroding governmental integrity and bureaucratic independence. He therefore insists that conflicts among monopolies will continue, whether economically or militarily, so long as capitalism itself exists. The epoch of modern capitalism shows us that certain relations are established between capitalist alliances based on the economic partition of the world, while parallel to this fact and in connection with it, certain relations are established between political alliances, between states, on the basis of the territorial division of the world, of the struggle for colonies, of the struggle for economic territory. The closing decades of the 19th century saw an unprecedented scramble among capitalist powers for territorial control of colonies, marking a new and intensified phase of imperialist expansion directly linked to the rise of finance capital. Between 1876 and 1900, Africa and Polynesia experienced massive colonial occupation, with European powers controlling 90% of Africa by the end of this period, compared to only 10% at its start. Great Britain significantly expanded its colonial holdings between 1860 and 1880, with France and Germany dramatically increasing their colonial territories from 1880 onward. These years corresponded directly with capitalism's transition from free market to monopolistic finance capitalism. Lenin argues that this period of colonialism brought forth the final partition of the globe, in the sense that the colonial policy of the capitalist countries had completed the seizure of the unoccupied territories on our planet. For the first time, the world was completely shared out, so that in the future, only redivision was possible. Territories can now only pass from one owner to another, instead of passing as unowned territory to an owner. It is beyond doubt, therefore, that the transition of capitalism to monopoly capitalism to finance capitalism is connected with the intensification of the struggle for the partition of the world. This shift is illustrated clearly in Britain's changing political stance and ideological orientation to the question of imperialism. Lenin quotes the British statesman Disraeli in the mid-19th century, calling colonies millstones around our necks, whereas by the end of the century, leading politicians like Cecil Rhodes and Joseph Chamberlain openly championed imperialism as essential for British economic and social stability. Rhodes, for example, bluntly asserted in 1895 that to avoid domestic unrest or a bloody civil war, it was necessary for Britain to acquire new lands to settle the surplus population, to provide new markets. Lenin remarks that Rhodes' imperialism was at least more honest than that of the bourgeois theorists who tried to justify expansionist policies under the moral pretext of advancing civilization abroad. Lenin distinguishes between the old capitalist countries of Britain and France, with the newly rapidly developing capitalist powers such as Germany, America, and Japan, and economically backward yet imperialistically active states like Russia. The uneven development of these countries meant uneven colonial expansion, leading to sharp geopolitical rivalries. Crucially, Lenin underscores the fact that colonialism and imperialism under monopoly capitalism fundamentally differ from earlier forms where colonialism took the form of a policy choice. Modern imperialism is distinct as it is driven by finance capital's demand and direct control over sources of raw materials as a structural necessity. Monopoly capitalism seeks colonies not simply for political prestige, but to secure essential resources, guarantee market monopolies, and maximize profits. Monopolistic associations aggressively seek control of raw materials such as cotton, minerals, or timber to sustain industrial growth, thereby intensifying the struggle for colonial control. Lenin says, the principal feature of modern capitalism is the domination of monopolistic combines of the big capitalists. These monopolies are the most durable when all the sources of raw materials are controlled by one group. The more capitalism develops, the more the need for raw materials arises, the more bitter competition becomes, and the more feverishly the hunt for raw materials proceeds all over the world, the more desperate becomes the struggle for the acquisition of colonies. Finance capital's drive for economic dominance thus inevitably expands into political control, shaping global diplomatic relations. Finance capital and its corresponding foreign policy, which reduces itself to the struggle of the great powers for the economic and political division of the world, gives rise to a number of transitional forms of national dependence. The division of the world into two principal groups, the colony-owning countries on the one hand and colonies on the other, is not the only typical feature of this period. There is also a variety of forms of dependence. Countries which formally are politically independent, but which are in fact enmeshed in the net of financial and diplomatic dependence. In this chapter, Lenin explains how imperialism marks a distinct historical stage in the evolution of capitalism, characterized fundamentally by the transition from free competition to monopoly. He defines imperialism as the monopoly stage of capitalism, highlighting its emergence from competition towards concentration. In other words, for Lenin, imperialism arises precisely when capitalist economies concentrate capital to the point where it gives rise to monopolies. For Lenin, this stage can be identified clearly through 5 economic characteristics. First, imperialism emerges when monopolies play a decisive role in economic life. Second, it is marked by the merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the subsequent creation of a powerful financial oligarchy. Third, the export of capital takes precedence over the export of commodities. Fourth, imperialism involves the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world among themselves. And fifth, it culminates with the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers. Here, Lenin critiques Karl Kautsky's alternative conceptualization of imperialism as merely a product of highly developed industrial capitalism, defined primarily as the striving of every industrial capitalist nation to annex all large areas of agrarian territory. Lenin regards this definition as superficial and fundamentally flawed because it ignores the centrality of finance capital and reduces imperialism to a simple policy preference rather than recognizing its economic necessity rooted in monopoly capitalism. Lenin further criticizes Kautsky's notion of a peaceful ultra-imperialism, dismissing it as a lifeless abstraction and ultra-nonsense, for overlooking how real-world domination of finance capital intensifies global disparities and economic contradictions, rather than alleviate them. Lenin argues against the idea that international monopolies could peacefully coexist, emphasizing instead that imperialism inherently involves aggressive competition, as finance capital and the trusts do not diminish but increase the differences in the rate of growth of various parts of the world economy. To drive this point home, Lenin points to the rapid expansion of railways in colonies and semi-colonies, reflecting capital exports and deepening imperialist rivalries. From 1890 to 1913, railways expanded dramatically in the colonies, from 125,000 to 347,000 kilometers, representing massive investments of finance capital. Britain significantly increased railway holdings due to its colonies, despite Germany's superior industrial growth. Lenin underscores this contradiction by noting that while Germany had an overwhelming superiority over Britain in industrial productivity, Britain still held extensive colonial territories, prompting Lenin to ask, what means other than war could there be under capitalism to overcome this disparity? Lenin argues that imperialism is not only a stage of capitalist expansion driven by monopoly and the export of capital, but also a system characterized by economic parasitism, social decay, and political opportunism. Drawing heavily on the liberal economist John Hobson and supplanting his insights with a Marxist analysis, Lenin outlines how monopoly capitalism fosters stagnation and the rise of a rentier class, and how this transformation shapes both domestic class structures and international relations. He says, the export of capital, one of the essential economic bases of imperialism, still more completely isolates the renters from production and sets the seal of parasitism on the whole country that lives by the exploitation of labor of several overseas countries and colonies. The world has become divided into a handful of money-lending states on the one side and a vast majority of debtor states on the other. A handful of creditor nations dominate debtor countries, extracting tribute and profits through loans, financial manipulation, and political coercion, while military force and political influence serve as tools for the enforcement of this dominance. Such characteristics of monopoly capitalism emerge and serve the interests of a new rentier class that lives not by producing value, but by passively collecting interest, dividends, and rent from foreign investments. At the heart of Lenin's argument on parasitism is the idea that monopoly capitalism is inherently contradictory and stagnant-prone. When monopolies dominate markets, they can suppress technological innovation, reduce efficiency, and even deliberately block progress, leading to technological stagnation. However, this system of parasitism not only reshapes economics, but also the social and political structure of imperialist countries. As income from overseas increases, a growing proportion of the population becomes economically idle or detached from production. According to Lenin, an immense accumulation of money capital in a few countries isolates rentiers from enterprise and entrenches unproductive wealth. For example, by the early 20th century, the percentage of British workers employed in productive, basic industries had sharply declined, and instead, an upper stratum of the workers had emerged, those engaged in service, administrative, or politically connected sectors. This privileged layer of the working class becomes a social base for opportunism, a tendency that Lenin insists must be understood in relation to imperialism's economic structure. These workers, who are often members of trade unions, cooperatives, or religious and sporting associations, are not representative of the proletariat as a whole. They benefit, however marginally, from imperialism's spoils and are politically mobilized to support reformist, nationalist, or even chauvinist agendas. Hobson himself, though not a Marxist, grasped this connection very well, noting how government contracts and imperial expansion created jobs in metal and shipbuilding towns, fostering popular support for aggressive foreign policy. Lenin extends this insight, observing that imperialism makes it economically possible to bribe the upper strata of the proletariat, and thereby fosters, gives shape to, and strengthens opportunism. This split within the working class, between a privileged upper layer and an impoverished proletarian base, is not merely a sociological fact, it has profound political consequences as well. Opportunist leaders emerge from the upper strata and serve as intermediaries between the bourgeoisie and the working class. They promote gradual reform over revolution, defend national interests over international solidarity, and in times of war, support the imperialist state. This social chauvinism has become fully integrated with bourgeois ideology in imperialist countries. The clearest historical example for Lenin is Britain itself. As early as 1858, Engels remarked that the English proletariat was becoming more and more bourgeois, and by the 1880s had lamented that there was no workers' party in Britain, only a division between conservative and liberal radical factions, with the working class gaily sharing in the feast of England's monopoly of the world market and the colonies. What had been an early symptom in England, its vast colonial empire and monopolistic grip on the world market, was by the early 20th century a generalized condition of the imperialist world order. 6 great powers controlled 86% of the colonial world, while finance capital, cartels, and debt relations locked the periphery into a system of dependent accumulation. While the older model of British imperialism rested on unilateral dominance, the imperialism of Lenin's day was defined by inter-imperialist rivalry, as multiple states competed to divide and redivide the world. This, Lenin notes, increases the contradictions not only between oppressor and oppressed nations, but also within the imperialist working class. In an era when capitalist monopolies dominate both politics and economics, the irreconcilability between imperialism and the genuine interests of the international proletariat had never been sharper. However, while imperialism breeds decay, it also generates resistance. Parasitism may corrupt a segment of the working class, but it also exposes the global nature of exploitation, uniting oppressed nations and the masses of workers into a shared condition of dispossession and wage slavery. Against the backdrop of imperialist rentierism, Lenin insists on the importance of seeing not only the forces that sustain opportunism, but also the forces that resist and counteract it, the revolutionary forces that point beyond capitalism's parasitic stage to its eventual overthrow. Imperialism, in its mature phase, is no longer merely a policy pursued by nation-states, but a structural condition of capitalism, inseparable from monopoly and global domination. In this context, Lenin's critique of imperialism extends beyond its surface-level injustices and instead examines how entire social classes, bourgeois, petty bourgeois, and even segments of the working class, align themselves ideologically with imperialist interests. Lenin's principal targets include bourgeois liberals, pacifist reformers, and most notably, centrist opportunists within the socialist movement, like Karl Kautsky, whose theoretical evasions serve to obscure the fundamental contradictions of imperialist capitalism. At the heart of Lenin's argument here is the idea that imperialism restructures class consciousness. With the rise of finance capital, a highly concentrated form of capital that creates a dense web of global dependencies, even small and medium capitalists are subordinated to the interests of monopoly. This realignment leads the propertied classes to fully embrace imperialism. Their enthusiasm for empire, expressed in nationalism, militarism, and racism, reflects not just ideological manipulation, but material alignment with imperialist interests. In his critique of imperialist ideology within the working class, he highlights the emergence of social imperialism, a term that he uses to describe socialists in words, but imperialists in deeds. He draws this concept from Hobson, who had noticed a similar phenomenon of Fabian imperialists in Britain. These figures do not defend imperialism openly, but they do so by omission, evading its roots in monopoly and finance domination, while offering pious wishes for reform, peace, or democratic alternatives to conquest. Therefore, bourgeois critics and liberal reformers are likewise disingenuous. They lament specific abuses of empire while failing to challenge its structural logic. Their proposals for reform, such as supervising trusts, regulating banks, or creating international tribunals, do not touch the essence of imperialism. Most defenders of empire couch their apologetics in the language of reason, peace, and progress, which Lenin argues is not accidental. It is precisely by framing imperialism as a matter of policy excess or moral failing that they obscure its economic foundations in finance capital and monopoly accumulation. This leads to Lenin's criticism of the limitations of the so-called anti-imperialist critiques that emerged in the United States around the Spanish-American War. Bourgeois Democrats opposed the annexation of the Philippines and other conquests as violations of the Constitution or as a betrayal of American Republican values. Some even drew quotes from Lincoln to denounce empire as despotism. Yet Lenin notes the shallowness of their critique. As long as all this criticism shrank from recognizing the inseparable bond between imperialism and the trusts, it remained a pious wish. This brings Lenin back to his critique of Kautsky, who he accuses of evading the core contradictions of imperialism. Kautsky argues that imperialism is not inevitable, that capitalist expansion could proceed peacefully through economic means rather than violence, and that democracy, rather than conquest, is the ideal form of capitalist development. Lenin denounces this line of reasoning as a betrayal of Marxism. It implies that monopoly capitalism could revert to a more natural state of free competition, a position that Lenin calls not only utopian, but reactionary. He points out that monopoly is not a distortion of capitalism, but its highest stage, and that the imperialist system cannot be separated from the competitive dynamics that produced it. Kautsky's nostalgia for peaceful capitalism, his faith in the mere operation of economic factors, amounts to a reformist retreat that shields imperialism from revolutionary critique. As Lenin declares, monopolies have already arisen precisely out of free competition. Even if monopolies now had begun to retard progress, it is not an argument in favor of free competition, which has become impossible after it has given rise to monopoly. For Lenin, the failure of Kautsky's critique lies in his refusal to grasp the dialectic of monopoly and conflict. By proposing a fantasy of ultra-imperialism, a world of peaceful cooperation among monopolies, Kautsky ignores the inevitability of war and crisis under capitalism. Even if the imperialist powers formed alliances for the joint exploitation of regions like China or Africa, these are only temporary truces, not a new stage of harmonious development. Peaceful alliances prepare the ground for wars, and in their turn grow out of wars. Instead of showing the living connection between periods of imperialist peace and imperialist war, Kautsky presents the workers with a lifeless abstraction. Lenin concludes that Kautsky's theory, then, serves not to clarify the contradictions of imperialism, but to obscure them, to reconcile workers to capitalism under the illusion of reform. And in doing so, he is unified with the social chauvinists, opportunists, and reactionaries in their efforts to undermine the revolutionary potential of the proletariat. In the final chapter, Lenin defines imperialism as a historically specific phase of capitalism, monopoly capitalism in its most advanced, parasitic, and decaying form. This stage, marked by the fusion of industrial and financial capital, the domination of monopolies, and the scramble for global control, represents not only the culmination of capitalist development, but also its approaching limits. But imperialism is not simply an extension of capitalism abroad through colonial conquest or militarism. It is the structural transformation of capitalism itself, signaling the transition towards a higher socio-economic order. Lenin identifies 4 key manifestations of monopoly that characterize the imperialist epoch. First, monopolies arise directly from the concentration of production. Cartels, trusts, and syndicates are not accidental deviations from competition. They emerge organically from it. Even Britain, a long-time bastion of free trade, developed monopolist structures once its productive forces matured. Second, monopoly is expressed in the seizure and control of raw materials. In industries such as coal and iron, central to modern capitalism, monopolies control access to essential inputs, creating a strategic advantage and sharpening the antagonism between cartelized and non-cartelized sectors. This intensifies global competition, not only among firms, but also states seeking exclusive access to resources. Third, monopoly is rooted in the transformation of banking. The rise of finance capital, defined as the merger of industrial and banking capital, has produced a financial oligarchy of unprecedented power. A handful of massive banks in each advanced capitalist country dominate the flow of capital, orchestrating investment decisions, mergers, and credit systems that shape the global economy. This oligarchy casts a close network of dependence relationships over all the economic and political institutions of bourgeois society by fusing economic power with political authority in the form of state corporate domination. Fourth, monopoly shapes modern colonial policy. While earlier colonialism may have been characterized by chaotic land grabs, the full division of the world by 1900 marked a new era of monopolist colonialism, defined by the struggle for economic territory, profitable concessions, capital export, and spheres of influence. As Lenin argues, when 9/10 of Africa has been seized, there was inevitably ushered in the era of monopoly possession of colonies. From this moment forward, imperialist conflict would take the form of wars of redivision between great powers vying for control over a finite world. One of the most politically significant outcomes of this transformation is the ability of the bourgeoisie to bribe sections of the working class with monopoly superprofits. Lenin argues that high profits in particular industries or countries make it economically possible to win workers to the side of the bourgeoisie of a given industry or a given nation against all others. This is the material foundation of opportunism, a tendency that first appeared in Britain, the earliest imperialist power, but has since become global. Lenin cautions against reformist illusions that downplay this connection, warning that the most dangerous of all in this respect are those who do not wish to understand that the fight against imperialism is a sham and a humbug unless it is inseparably bound up with the fight against opportunism. The fusion of imperialism and opportunism is not merely an ideological betrayal. It is structurally rooted in the very functioning of monopoly capitalism. Attempts to downplay this reality, such as the optimism of Kautsky and others, only serves to obscure the class contradictions that imperialism has intensified. When a single enterprise plans the extraction, transportation, processing, and distribution of raw materials and finished goods across vast distances, serving tens of millions of consumers, it becomes evident that the productive forces have outgrown the constraints of the capitalist system. Monopoly capitalism, in this sense, is capitalism becoming obsolete. Private property relations and the anarchy of the market no longer correspond to the socialized nature of production. They form a shell which must inevitably decay, a shell which may remain in a state of decay for a fairly long period, but which will inevitably be removed. Lenin concludes that imperialism must be defined as capitalism in transition, more precisely, as moribund capitalism. It is a stage in which the contradictions of capitalism are both intensified and made more visible. Production is socialized, but appropriation remains private. Monopolies coordinate economic life, but only to serve the profit interests of a financial oligarchy. The productive forces are globalized, but political domination remains in the hands of a few imperialist powers. This stage, he insists, cannot be reformed, It can only be overcome. This video was made possible by the generous support of my patrons. If you would like to join them in helping grow this channel, you can do so at the links in the description below.